intelligence. In other words, there's something about us that's more than tribal religions and more than just, certainly more than mere materiality. My neurons did not make me do it,
What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip. You're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. That's right. This is the source for ideological ingredients so you can brew your own faith. We don't want to think for you. We want to think with you. And today on the podcast is the one and the only Ilia Delio. That's right, the Josephine C. Connelly Endowed Chair in Theology at Villanova University. She is, well, freaking awesome, amazing, zesty. This is going to be a straight up fun conversation. She's the author of Care for Creation, A Hunger for Wholeness, Soul, Space, and Transcendence, Making All Things New, The Unbearable Wholeness of Being, God, Evolution, and the Power of Love. And she's won a whole bunch of awards, teaches, people love hearing her lecture. And in this conversation, we talk about some evolutionary panentheism. We talk about some science and religion, her journey in and out and back into faith. We talk about AI, cyborgs, all sorts of excitement, and the future of faith in the world. It's an exciting conversation, and Ilia is one of the contributors to a book called How I Found God in Everyone and Everywhere, edited by Andrew Davis and Philip Clayton. And Ilia's in that book. It's an anthology of spiritual memoirs. It's includes essays by Richard Rohr, Rupert Sheldrake, John Cobb, Keith Ward, Marjorie Suhaki, Brad Artson, Deepak Chopra, Matthew Fox, Cynthia Bourgeois. Yeah, it's an exciting collection of essays that are spiritual memoirs about people who go on. They're telling their spiritual journey and the role reflection around science and mysticism and all that kind of thing plays, and how they came back to finding God again after leaving God behind, as not this God that's up there and out there, but an immanent, present, loving, relational understanding of the divine. Some people call panentheism. Anyway, we're going to have a bunch of fun in this interview. And here's the thing. This is just one of the authors in the book. And I am doing a pop-up book club called Cosmic Campfire about this very book with my friends Mike Morrell and Science Mike. We're putting together the Cosmic Campfire, a spiritual journey to finding God in everyone and everywhere. It's an online group where you can get together, and you'll have access to a private Facebook group where you can discuss, share, reflect, hear other people that are going through a journey of leaving God behind, finding God again, and all that kind of stuff. You'll get an email from all the different people that are in the book itself, in the How I Found God in Everyone and Everywhere. We'll have a live session each week for 6 weeks as we go through the book with different people from the text itself. So maybe you'll get to see John Cobb talk about some process theology with Science Mike, or Rabbi Brad Artson talk to Mike Morrell about some God, or maybe you'll see me and Marjorie Suhaki talk it up, or Deepak, or Richard, or Matthew. That you see how this goes. Well, and the great thing about this book club is it's pay what you want, so there's no reason not to join. You can pay $0. $3 million is an option. $10, $20, whatever it is you want to contribute. We just want you to be a part of the book club. And honestly, we'd rather you buy the book than give us the donation. The most important part is I think there are a whole lot of people who are wrestling with the relationship to their tradition, the language, the image, the signs, and all that kind of stuff, but also have this yearning, this pull, this encounter, this experience with transcendence, with the mystery we call God, and what is it like to find a community of people and people that are ahead of us in this journey, like those in this book. So get the book, wrestle with it, join the book club, find some friends and peers. And I'm excited about Homebrewed listeners hanging out with Science Mike listeners on the internet. We had fun when we did the crossover podcast episode, and we said, let's do this. So sign up, go to cosmiccampfire.party, cosmiccampfire.party, and you can join the community. And it's going to be just a blast. It's going to be a blast. And the last thing I'd say before jumping in is the Cosmic Campfire Book Club is also going to be connected to an event next February. I think like 1st through the 3rd. We're going to be doing the Cosmic Campfire event in North Carolina in the Triangle. That's Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill. And I can't wait for it. It's going to be tons of fun. And there we're going to be wrestling with science, religion, spirituality, and what the three have to contribute to each other today. So head over to cosmiccampfire.party, join the group, and prepare to have some fun. Oh, we're also doing a big book giveaway for it. So that's even another good reason to go. You can get free books. All right. Enjoy this amazing conversation. Head over to my new website too and check it out, tripfuller.com. All right. Peace. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip, and today Ilia Delio is in the house. She's the author of the chapter in the book we've been talking about, and her chapter is titled "The Entangled God of My Heart." And guess what? She's also written a whole bunch of other books. Has worked as a scientist, as a sister, and as a pioneer of religion and science conversation. So, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Trip. I really appreciate it.
So when you were writing this kind of spiritual memoir of someone who has wrestled so intensely with religion and science and really cultivated the language of the Christian tradition to draw connections, I was fascinated that right at the beginning of your chapter, you said that on the first page of your doctoral dissertation, which is in pharmacology, you wrote that in the simplest cell of life lies the mystery of creation. So take us back to the moment that you're like, what brought you to write that sentence, and what did you have no idea was included in the promissory note of that sentence?
Right. Totally. Yeah. So I was a hardcore scientist. I really thought I was probably like a materialist of some sort. I really thought science really would provide the answers to our deepest questions. Mm-hmm. And so it was, the pursuit of science and understanding the brain and understanding the nervous system that I thought this is the way to go, and a claim to fame. Of course, I was, big dreams, always, having the Nobel Prize in the background of my mind. But as I began to do science, I was actually working on the motor neuron systems. I was an electrophysiologist studying motor neuron neuropathies like Lou Gehrig's disease. Mm-hmm. And so I was studying the electrical dysfunction of in animal models. And truthfully, while we know so much and so much more today in neuroscience, certainly than I was there, now almost 30 years ago, it was just astounding, like really astounding when you looked at a single motor neuron under a high-powered electron microscope and this whole life within it. And you go, how is this possible? So my question, that wasn't even religious. It was just a question of awe. Mm-hmm. It was just a question of sheer, the sheer wonder of it, that as much as I could measure things, I couldn't grasp really this incredible life of this single cell. Mm-hmm. And so, it was around that time, actually, it was while I was studying pharmacology or doing my studies in neurophysiology, that I discovered the life of Thomas Merton, the monk. And I never heard of this guy, and I didn't know what a contemplative was. Although I was brought up, as I said in my chapter, brought up mm-hmm. Catholic. So I'm from an Italian Catholic neighborhood in New Jersey. So it's sort of, I guess there was something genetically wired there from the beginning. And always sort of fascinated by religion, but not in any, committed way. But discovering Merton and realizing the ungraspable awness of the single cell sort of went together for me. And I began to at least open up to this mystery of life, which is beyond science. Certainly science does not like the M word, because it's all supposedly attainable and quantifiable at some point.
Yeah.
And I had to admit it. There was mystery here. And so I began to pursue this and, this path of mystery. And then that's how I got here in a certain way, throw yourself into mystery and the rest is history, so to speak.
Well, so one of the things I found interesting about your story is that awe, that mystery, remains for you a question, but it's not a mystery in a deflationary sense that a lot of contemporary religious or spiritual or theological thinkers see it as, where mystery becomes the justification not to critically and faithfully wrestle with tradition and science and your spiritual experiences. So tell us how the mystery kind of took this form of calling you forward in your life.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the latter statement that you say there, using mystery, well, I don't know what it is, so it's just mystery. That's like a God of gaps explanation from my perspective. And that's not what, when I say enter the mystery. And here I would use Karl Rahner's notion that it's not so much that we're seeking the mystery, but the mystery has sought us, that holy mystery of God. And so I would say more, my entrance into the mystery was being grasped by this holy otherness of God, this incredible presence that was wholly other and wholly near. And, from my perspective, I think that it's a turning point because you're no longer just pursuing this mystery as something to study or to know in some intellectual way. It's this being grasped that you have to grapple with it because it's a strange phenomenon. You have to, in a sense, as Rana would say and many others, you have to surrender to it. And that's so contrary to our whole intellectual system of grasping and controlling that which we know. This is just the opposite. You have to let go of what you know in order to be known in a deeper way. And I think that was really significant for me. It was I began to let go and to allow myself to be taken into this mystery.
So you don't mention the response of your parents, but when you turned down a postdoc at Johns Hopkins, I just assume that at least my mom would have called, and even if she's never prayed over me, it would have happened on the phone when I said no to that and was like, you know what, I'm thinking no, I'm gonna try the monastic life. So what was it like as a student who's been pursuing aggressively, successfully a career to have that mystery, that awe address you, seize you, and redirect you that dramatically? Yeah.
Again, I think, I was successful in my work in neurophysiology and my life was being mapped out for me, so my advisor had me on the NIH, committee, and I did go down to Hopkins and I signed all the papers in the departments of neurology and neuropathology. So I was their number one postdoc coming in. And, what does it take to turn something like that down? First, I think it's the fact that I had to make a radical decision. And I think that's the one thing about being grasped by God or by being grasped by this holy mystery of love. It's not just a feel-good thing. It's not therapy. It is rather that it demands a response from us. And it demanded a response from me in particular. And I had to make a radical decision. Would I, pursue my postdoc at Hopkins, or would I, enter into this cave of the monastery, of this radical unknown? And I knew deep down, and this is how we always know if we're doing something right, there's a deep sense of peace. And it even if there's anxiety there's a deep sense of rightness. This is the right thing to do. And so I did make that radical decision of turning down Hopkins and entering a monastery. But my parents thought that I was brainwashed. My colleagues thought that I had inhaled too many chemicals in the lab and was suffering from an emotional breakdown. So they all thought that there was something wrong with me. And I thought it was the first time that there was something really right with me, that I wasn't following a trajectory that was mapped out by careerism or, the dictates of culture and society that says success means climbing the ladder.
Right.
It was just choosing the opposite. And it was a moment of, I think, interior freedom in that sense.
So you describe coming into monastic life and then discovering this tension that's kind of implicit in the theological depiction of God there that didn't even cohere with your own experience of the sacred in that life and this quest that kind of triggers your theological quest.
Yes.
And I think a lot of Christians today walk away from the faith because they feel that very same tension. So can you describe the picture of God that the church has inherited that even its own sacred rhythms want to undo, let alone that science and our experience today is kind of begging us to grow beyond?
Right. Yeah. So, the monastery was, monastery is a sense of culture of God, like a whole greenhouse of God, I think I called it. But I entered, now you have to remember that I did not enter a contemporary monastery. I entered the most traditional monastery I could find. I had this notion that the harder the life, the more the discipline, the holier that I would become. I don't know where I got these ideas from, but there they were. So I entered a very traditional monastery. And so the notion of God in the monastery was very Neoplatonic, in the sense that there was a radical, I'm not even sure it was Neoplatonic, a radical, almost Cartesian dualism, this radical transcendence of God and, this kind of fallenness of humanity and the need to undergo radical suffering and discipline in order to return to God. And it was the way the life was lived out that really made me question, is this really what is this what Jesus was about? I mean, we could have no particular friendships. We had no contact with the outside world. And I thought I really longed for materiality again. I longed to be back in the lab. I longed to be with people, because that's the place that I discovered God. So I was renouncing the very thing that I had originally brought me there. And I thought it was an unhealthy way of living a Christian life. So as I say, I was in the pea patch one day because it was a self-supporting life. So we grew all our own vegetables, and I dug a tunnel in the pea patch, hoping that I could get beyond the cloister to the other side, sort of like the Shawshank Redemption, if I could make my way through the tunnel. But I did eventually leave. But it was a good experience. But I think that experience sharpened my pursuit, my own spiritual pursuit. I knew what was not the God of Jesus Christ for me.
So when you go and start pursuing theological education, what was the thinker you first fell in love with that kind of, enlivened the passion and sent you off questing for more? Yeah.
So I think, I'd want to say up front, I didn't even know what theology was. I have to tell you, I was in a community where our novice director was undergoing a midlife crisis of some sort. And I was probably a lot to handle because I asked a lot of questions. So they called me in and they said, we'd like to send you to school to study spirituality. And I said, what is spirituality? I have no idea what that is. So they thought, I thought, that sounds so fluffy, how about theology? So they said, fine, you can go study theology. So I was actually sent to study theology as a way to get out of everyone's hair. And I thought, well, read a few books, how difficult can this be, So I was sent to Fordham because I had to be at a Catholic school. And I thought, oh my God, and again, I started with a half-baked, desire to be doing this. But once I started engaging in patristic and medieval writings, which loved. I loved the ancient thinkers, the Greek thinkers. They were so expansive in their thinking. And the theologian, well, truthfully, the person who really was influential on me was Ewart Cousins, who was the big Bonaventure scholar and, very into Whitehead and Teilhard. He was a very integrative thinker. Mm-hmm. So being with Ewart, you had to think like an Etch-a-Sketch. You couldn't think linearly or analytically. You had to think integratively. So I loved him. Others couldn't stand him if you were an analytical thinker. But I think it's through Ewart and Bonaventure is probably my first theologian who I really fell in love with, and that's because he was so integrative in his the Christology included cosmos, included body, included spirit. It was this dynamic vision of the whole. Ewart's breaking that open through the coincidence of opposites, the dialectic of nature itself, reconciled in this person of Jesus as the Christ. And I found that really a dynamic, and it was engaging, and that led me to Teilhard as well, through Bonaventure Teilhard. So that was my first love.
So when you start finding theology to be a place where the conversations that were calling you were being had, and that even these ancient figures of the church were discussing and wrestling with questions that you're just learning to form. Like, how do you see theology vocationally in its role in your life and your own ability to articulate for so many in a larger audience a vision of the faith today that's resonating?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. I've had to really grow into this, quite honestly, because I find myself today in a position I couldn't have imagined if someone had dreamed it up and told me 20 years ago, hey, you're going to be like, this integrative thinker in the 21st century. I would have looked at them and said, right, I'll be Pope too. But I think the vocation of a theologian today is one of the most important vocations one can have. And I'm not saying that as a theologian, we need persons who can begin to not just integrate across the disciplines of science and religion and psychology, but those who are also, I think the task of theology is the quest for wholeness, not just holiness, but holiness as wholeness. Mm-hmm. And there's such a deep longing today for wholeness, such a fragmented culture and a fragmented world. We no longer even know where to turn or how to find that wholeness. And so I do think we have a theological task before us to make wholes out of the partials that we find ourselves in. Mm-hmm. And I do think that's really what the best of the church fathers and the medieval writers did, and the mystics as well. They were whole makers in that sense. And that means we have to get out of our hyper specializations with our technical language and our jargon that only 3 people can articulate and understand. I think hyperspecialization and this quest for a type of knowledge that separates us and makes us an elite few is just the most unhealthy path for any form of discipline, but certainly for theology. So we need integrators. We're losing a sense of meaning and purpose today in our contemporary 21st century, and we're deeply longing for that.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that you do in your own work where you're engaging the sciences is give back to the scientific community their interiority, their subjectivity, the permission to acknowledge their own consciousness and participation in the cosmos. And I think that is a big task in the same way that it's difficult for even biblical scholars that teach at seminaries. Right. They've been so trained to treat the text on these through different types of critical theories, historical criticism, that they don't read the text as if they're sacred.
Right,
and,
the subject is removed. The subject isn't there.
And so when you sit with people who are even in congregations and the text and our cosmos, it's like you have a literalist reading of the Bible or a vapid one, or you have a cosmological literalism in science. like, how do you give the invitation to open yourselves back up in an affirming way to that depth dimension, the subjectivity, the interiority of the cosmos?
Yeah. I guess my own turn in this, because we're all trained in the system, right? And so we're all trained in these tools of critical thinking and objectivity and all this stuff. But I guess it was realizing actually through the lens of quantum physics, that it is an observer universe, that the role of consciousness in the determination of material reality is much more significant than we ever thought before. And so I think that's a factor for me. I think the other factor that's also important is, I think at heart, I'm really a medievalist. I'm just a medievalist disguised in a 21st century person. Or I'm a 21st century person that longs for the medieval life. I don't know. There's something there because, for example, Bonaventure in particular would look at the pursuit of theology not as this object. He was less than Thomas in having a critical role for reason. Mm-hmm. Bonaventure had this deep place of subjectivity and interiority for the theological pursuit. In other words, to do theology was to be spiritually transformed. And I think that goes for whatever discipline we're in. Even as a scientist, there's no science. There's no truly objective science. That's a fallacy of misplaced concreteness, to use Whitehead's term. It's every determination in science, every pursuit has always a subjective conscious component to it. And I think it's naming that conscious component as having a critical role in the reality, and then realizing that the reality itself can transform that consciousness. It's a redactive, rather a recurrent type of process. It's an I-thou process, really. Mm-hmm. It's not just me determining something. That something is also determining me. And I think that that kind of involvement of the personal subject in the pursuit of knowledge is so much more enriching, because I think it goes back to the notion that I am contributing to what this whole is becoming, and this whole is becoming more whole, in a sense, as I continue to ask questions and to pursue knowledge. So it's true that more and more scientists are awakening to this. I mean, I've had a number of physicians in the recent past who are very interested now in this science religion integrative approach to wholeness. And I think also the rise of centering prayer movement, of Richard's living school, where contemplative pedagogy now is gaining prominence, the place of an interior space. I mean, whoever talked about interiority prior to the late 20th, 21st century? So there is something very good that has reemerged in our own time, and it's the third dimension. I think we have two eyes that see in the physical world, but we have a third eye, and that's the eye of the heart. And I think, modernity sort of blinded that eye of the heart. It made believe it wasn't there, and that we have these two eyes that are going to see things. And I think what we're awakening to is the third eye of the heart.
So if you went back in time to graduate student you sitting there deciding about going to postdoc stuff, like what do you think the younger version of yourself would think if she walked in and listened to one of your talks in the present?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I have no idea. You mean if I were younger or someone else were younger?
So and I thought of this just when I interviewed Rupert Sheldrake, where he talks about how the power of this kind of reductive materialism that has this mechanistic view of the world is so strong that he doesn't even know until he had certain experiences that he wouldn't roll his eyes at himself, and I think one of the challenges of this that's really spelled out in all the different stories in the book, but one of the tasks we have as leaders of religious and spiritual traditions is giving people permission to re-embrace the fullness of their humanity. Yeah. And a lot of people don't realize that they have believed philosophical conclusions that are not scientifically determined or necessary, and then cut themselves off from this element that every other culture other than Western materialism has always cultivated in some sense. Like we're the odd ones. Yeah,
it's true. We're sort of like the last kid on the block, so to speak. I mean, the Asian traditions, the Hindu traditions, consciousness has always been, that's the forefront of their, religious beliefs. So there's several things here, one, and I think we can separate here these religious inclinations from culture, from the philosophical turns, from the role of the Catholic Church in distancing itself from science. There's so many interacting forces that have gone into play here that have sort of given rise to this, this modern person as the autonomous, self-thinking individual, in which, the pursuit of knowledge has leads to, in a sense, the greater sense of control and determination of world becoming. And if I were to go back, if I heard what I'm talking about today as a young scientist, I wonder if I would have stayed in science. In other words, when I was in science, there were, this type of thinking wasn't happening. And so for me, it was a radical decision. Like if I really am to pursue a more holistic, integrative, path to God, I need to leave science to do that. Now I think we're beginning to realize that we can pursue this path in the many disciplines we find ourselves in. So I guess God had to, take me out to make me a bridge into the new world type thing. But I think we have been locked into an intellectual hubris over the last 400 years, and I think Western modernity is not part of the solution. It's a large part of the problem. And I have to place there as well our whole education, our university system is really at the heart of the problem as well. I mean, we're right out of the modern thinking subject, Newtonian in structure. And so we're not really educating for a complex, interdisciplinary world. We don't know how to think along, in this world. And therefore, I think just the sheer surviving in this world preempts the deeper desires or that, addressing those desires within us. We long for something that is more participative, that is more integral, that's more whole, that, and I don't think, God is the problem. We've made God the problem, but that name God just points to the ground of holy mystery at the heart of our lives. And we're longing for that. So, I'm glad we're getting out of modernity. It's a slow death, a really, really slow death for us here in the West. But I do feel that we will exit it eventually.
So when you think of all the work you've done at retelling the Christian narrative, the narrative of spirit, the evolutionary narrative of the cosmos, for ministers and faith leaders who are looking for a way to start telling the story of the Christian tradition in ways that cohere with the larger cosmic story, what kind of advice, outline, ideas, and things would you kind of give to them to help them think through it?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is let's begin with Genesis. Let's begin with creation story, since that's where the whole kit and caboodle begins. And let's make that creation story. Creation is just really a term to speak about relationship with a creator. But to keep that locked into some ancient universe or cosmos, let's begin with the Big Bang. Let's begin where science tells us. As far as we can tell, this whole kit and caboodle begins. So let's begin with big history, And I do think, and here I would follow Teilhard de Chardin's notion that evolution means that all theories, everything that we know needs to be revisited in light of an evolving universe. So we have to now factor in change, complexity, incompleteness, futurity, in whatever, certainly in the religious story that we're telling. We have created a narrative that is static and fixed, and then we kind of round it out with a little, twigs from science or psychology or something like that. But the basic narrative is it doesn't work. I mean, Christology, eschatology, pneumatology, all these things need to be revamped in light of evolution. And, we get like Teilhard and Whitehead to some extent, and Tillich, and people have been, but there's nothing that's really pulled it together yet. We have strands of stuff all over the place, and, people write dissertations on this, but we need to pull this together into a type. Here's where religion, in other words, like, could we envision a new type of religious being that would then have a consciousness of evolution, of complexity, of, incompleteness, of a becoming, a divine becoming, and so that's the thing, I think. So for religious leaders, they have a tall task because, how do you preach on evolution, if your congregation is pretty sure that, God created things like 6,000 years ago or whatever. So it's a huge challenge, but I think we have to take up this challenge. People otherwise leave the rise of the nuns are, rising like the tidal waves, they're just rising nuns, and the nuns, they've been there and it's burnt out and they're done with it. So what do we have? What are we left with in these fragments of religion? So something new must take place, and we need to do the heavy lifting to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. So when a lot of the conversations that you have engaged in are ones that are popular conversations around science and culture, like transhumanism and AI and this type of stuff. Yeah. Can you kind of, maybe introduce a few of those topics, but also, like, how do you understand yourself as a theologian talking about topics that our kids are going to have actually have thought about, and we're trying to prepare them to wrestle with topics we don't know exactly what they're going to look like. That's right. The church rarely has ethical opinions on things that haven't happened for 500 years.
That's true. From my perspective, it's like, if we, I really believe that God is at the heart of this whole kit and caboodle. And so, there's several things. One is trying to understand a dynamic God. Like, I don't think God is some stay-at-home static thing. It's the dynamism of Holy Mystery that is both empowering our lives to become something new, and then what this new might be. And here's where more and more I am almost certain that we Homo sapiens, are really a species in evolution. We've not always been here. We will not always be here. We are becoming something. And so I do find the whole rise of technology, AI, information technology, and artificial intelligence, really interesting because of its rapid rise and the way it has really pulled us into, I would say, new ways of thinking, new ways of connecting. And there's something about that that's really changing us as we develop it. And there's something about AI and the human, I do think, will move us into a new type of species up ahead. In my view, it's all God. It's not opposed to God. It's not like, oh my gosh, we're leaving God. It's actually, that's what absolute love does. It invites us into new being. It invites us to become something more than what we are. And that's the beauty of life, and God as life. That's the whole point of it. I think we find ourselves today in the early 21st century sort of at an impasse. It seems like an impasse, like the human person, the Homo sapiens sapiens, is up against the wall. And yet we're sort of nature, through this information, we're creating ourselves into something new. We're getting out of the impasses in our own way. It's really interesting. And I would just say the whole thing is empowered by divine love. Rather than people might see it contrary to God, or, So it's understanding why religion is actually at the heart of technology. And I think we've separated these things, like there's religion and technology. But I think what's happened is religion has become rather old and static, the way it's, formulated and practiced. And there's a real need for transcendence. There's a real need to go beyond ourselves. And cyberspace, I think, has provided that new space of transcendence. Now, how to bring those things together is our task.
Well, so maybe you can kind of, how do you understand humans' ongoing relationship with technology? Because I feel like there are lessons to learn once as a theologian or philosopher. You
Absolutely.
notice that humans have always had an evolving relationship with their technology. And,
right.
And most people in your congregation only call things technology if they were invented after they were 30, right?
Yeah.
Like, and so there are lessons to be learned. So it's not just a complete shock of newness. We've figured out how to evolve and have more just communities because of our relationship to our technology.
Yeah. So, I think there's several things. One is I think how we think about technology is an important thing. Is it a tool to help us? Are we creating tools that enable, to us to do better things? Or is that technology an extension of ourselves? Mm-hmm. And I think that's how that question, the latter question, really depends on how we understand what nature is. And I think more and more we're beginning to see there are underlying natures to nature, that it's not just sheer biology, but underlying that is informational flow. And so I think if we look at technology as an extension of what we are, rather than just as a tool to help us, then we can begin to shape this technology as part and parcel of the desires that we hope for as a community of beings on a planet Earth. And therefore I think we do need to develop an ethics of AI. I think it's not just sheer technology for technology's sake. So we know that technology can go either way, right? We can develop maybe robots that will come to hate us and, take over us. We can develop nuclear weapons to blow ourselves apart, or we can develop technology that actually might enhance the best of what we are, as compassionate, as peaceful, as just. And so right now, I think the extension, if I take technology as an homo extensiveness, into a new form, then I think it's how we program those, that new technology and how we use it. I think we're at a point of critical decision making for the next few generations on what this human, what I call, I'm actually just not using the word person. I'm trying to get away from that because I still think person still connotes individual, and it doesn't bring us into the greater reality that we are a life system, but we're a life system within life systems. And I think AI is part of that life system. We're extending that life system now on a new level of information in a new form. And if we can begin to think along those lines, we may be able to transcend what we are into something better, into something more. So it's my hope.
So when, tell us how you use the symbol of cyborg as a way of reflecting on the kind of changing nature of humans as part of a community of life.
Yeah. So that term cyborg, came from space travel in the early 60s where, as we began to send humans into space, we needed to keep them going, to breathe and to move. So we strapped mechanical devices to them. So it's a short for cybernetic organism, right? So the mechanical device can aid biological function, and biological function is aided by a mechanical device. So it's a cybernetic organism. But what I think Donna Haraway, really a brilliant philosopher in the mid-'80s, began to realize is that the cyborg is not only just a biological entity, but it's a symbol of nature itself. Mm-hmm. And I've been really impressed by her writings, along with Ann Cull and others, that this cyborg now symbolizes the plasticity of nature. In other words, nature is not fixed. Nature is not bounded. These are, you might say, just language that we use to locate what nature is at this moment. But the cyborg indicates to us, know that what it is at this moment can become something new. We can merge, we can hybridize. And I think that's the beauty of cyborg life, is that nature can be hybridized. We can put a pig liver in a human body, and we can put a chip in, our knees and our arms and our brains, and we can have enhanced function. And so nature is elusive. I think that's what the cyborg says to me. Nature is elusive. It cannot be fully grasped, but rather it's open. It's in a plasticity. It can be changed. It can be, and I think that's that speaks to me of something at the heart of what we call nature that is much more open and free and future oriented than we've ever been able to comprehend. And so I like the term cyborg, even as a symbol of, human becoming.
One of the things that I was struck by, it could have just been that I read the cyborg
Manifesto.
The same time I was in an eco-philosophy class, so this could be unrelated.
Oh, yeah.
But in my head, the same time I was realizing how much the modernity, and in particular the West as shaped by Protestant understandings of souls getting saved outside of the world, that as you start to see the cyborg as a symbol of nature itself, you also start to realize that humanity has already denatured itself. And if we just look in our wake, we've altered this entire planet. Every ecosystem is touched by us, and we're just now realizing again that we're actually part of nature. And so the invitation back to reconcile with nature is both a call to reconcile to our past on the way we've impacted nature, and then choose to be conscious and responsible for how we pioneer that continuing relationship.
Right. Yeah. So, right. So, there's been, and I continue to think about this. There has been this idea that technology and ecology are in conflict with each other, that technology has been used to, as you use the term, denature nature, as we control nature and try to wrest, the powers of nature through technology. But I think there's two things, and I think, again, how to approach this question is much more philosophical than anything. And I think approaching both technology and ecology from what I might call an essentialistic perspective, it leads us into this conflict between technology and ecology. And here I think of Lynn White's notion that, especially in terms of Protestant or Christian, Christianity, it's like, the soul is more important than the body. And we've had this kind of quasi-alienated type of relationship to nature. And so while it's all very nice as our home and our background, really our true home is somewhere else, this otherworldliness mentality. But I think as we begin to explore technology, not as tool or, out of a philosophy of essentialism, but rather as more from the stance of maybe chaos theory, maybe information, informational flow, then I think there is a way to develop technology that is ecologically whole. In other words, what if we were to develop, if we through ourselves transcend ourselves through AI in a way that is inclusive of the whole oikos, that technology creates us as ecological beings on the whole. And I think we have to that's why I do think it's important at this point how we think about the development of AI and how we understand what nature is and what kind of philosophy we're bringing to that understanding. These are the critical underpinnings here. But I think that I actually think that AI could actually maybe even lead us to a re-enchantment of nature, if you will. If we were to bring AI, the level of the depth of consciousness back, interiority and ecology into a whole new matrix of relationality. In my view, and here's what I also think, nature, we can mess it all up as we're showing ourselves to do quite well. But there's something about nature that is inherently fruitful, optimistic, and oriented toward life. I always think we can destroy ourselves, we can blow ourselves up, but nature, and here I would go back to even more primitive forms of nature, they will survive. Even if we were to blow it up, cyanobacteria will just start all over again. And nature is constantly, I think, open. Nature is technological, right? So people have talked about being natural-born cyborgs. That's what nature does. It uses the tools of its environment for the optimization of life. And we're no different from what nature is. What we want to do is develop it towards the optimization of life.
No, I think that's really helpful. And one of the as someone who works in a lot of different Catholic settings. How does Catholic social teaching around life, technology, and the normal ethical debates that dominate Catholic, like how does thinking in this bigger framework of cosmic, of thinking cyborg and technology and this type of thing, reframe the way we have a lot of the constant popular debates in religious life?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of good points in Catholic social teaching, but I think they don't have the right cosmological and philosophical frameworks, in other words, consonant with what we now know from science, that could actually enact those principles into something that's more generative of a communitarian way of life, of a deepening of what we are. So I think they're good principles, but I think they're kind of stuck in old philosophy sometimes. I think we're a little bit too wedded to Aristotle at times. I think we have a hard time getting beyond essentialism, a substance thinking. We have sort of a substance abuse problem.
Every whitehead fan just like giggles. That's funny. I don't know if why is that not on a T-shirt?
But it's true. I mean, and so we have a hard time engaging Whitehead. We have a hard time engaging process of philosophy as the very stuff that that's underpinning this radical becoming of what we are. And I think we need to make some cosmological, philosophical turns before we can engage Catholic social teaching in a new way. So it's my own 2 cents on.
Well, one of the things recently, I guess it was 4 years ago, the one on the environment.
Was
one of the first times you have a clear delineation between the ecological crisis, essentially Western addiction to consumption patterns, the demand for growth in the economy, and it's framed not just as this is a problem, don't do it, but this is a pattern and habit of our way of being in the world that's destructive to the poor and pillaging the planet. And what process people might read into Pope Francis, our hopes and dreams, because we don't have a pope most of the time. But I did see that as a change, just because it was drawing the relational connections between patterns of living as opposed to making clarity on a prohibition.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. That was a landmark encyclical in many ways. I think it's the first time a pope has begun an encyclical not with some top-down, propositional statement or this kind of, spiritual layered onto the material, but beginning with the concrete reality of an environmental crisis, of an impending crisis, of the problem of the poor, our radical autonomy in the face of the need for interdependence. So there's a lot in that encyclical that I find really laudable, that's really noteworthy. However, it kind of also reflects, I think, the Catholic Church's ambivalent state with regard to science, right? On one hand, it's the recognition from the sciences of our radical interdependence, the need to make a shift out of our consumer habits into a new consciousness of interdependence. And yet, it takes evolution up to the point of the human person. There's a modified stance on evolution in that document, and then that doesn't go any further. And so I think there's sort of there's an attractive power of the document, we need to shift, but then at the point in which we can shift, and that is the church must embrace evolution. The church must undergo, must begin to live out, where is this modeled? What's the whole point if you don't have a community of faithful who are actually modeling, or even better, leaders in the church who are modeling interdependence, and a consciousness of belonging to a whole. So I would say, yes, the best of Catholic social teachings are embedded in that document. And I would say how unfortunate that, that we can't then embrace modern science in its totality. I mean, that means beginning with evolution and quantum physics as the pillars of, a radical shift in philosophically and theologically. And we haven't done that. And so what it becomes, another form of consumption. We have more to consume in terms of information.
Well, that actually makes me think of one of the images you used, you've used in a number of places, where you talk about, out of Teilhard, God as the one who draws the world from the future. And so can you describe how that image, in one sense, it reminds me of, in Walter Brueggemann's, theology of the Old Testament, he talks about God as the one who goes ahead and is the one, like the biblical image of God is the one that's ahead of you, not the one above you or below you. And, Moltmann picks up on that. Teilhard does. But that when you take these biblical images that kind of were minimized in an Aristotelian framework in the early church and medieval period, if you take these biblical images and then connect it with the scientific understanding of the world today, you actually find new resonances where, in a sense, becoming more evolutionary is actually becoming more biblical. And it's not this like, oh, this is just foreign stuff y'all are bringing into Christianity.
No, it is. I mean, Jack Hott speaks a lot to this point, where religion, evolution opens up the God of the future, and that is much more consonant with the biblical promise of hope. I mean, the whole New Testament, by the way, is based on hope and new creation. So the whole thing is oriented toward something new up ahead. But we did get wedded, I think, to Dante's paradigm, of heaven, hell, and earth in between. So, and I think this three-tiered wedding, the three-tiered wedding cosmos has been so ingrained in us. And it's so funny because people can be scientists and, professional people and highly educated, but they're wedded to this wedding cake thing, and, so it's hard to have a God of a three-tiered universe it's not a credible God. And I think that's part of the problem. I mean, I think we have deep cognitive dissonance, even if we're not even consciously aware of it. I think our brains must be in conflict, religiously and culturally, because we're living between these different worlds. Like, how do you have a God above when there's no above? Above what? And so below what, and so rather than an expansion of being, which is a little bit more consonant with the Big Bang universe. And so I do think, a radical revisiting of God, which certainly Teilhard and Whitehead and so many of the 20th century really tried to do. But at this point, I would go back to the beginning of our conversation. We've got to stop trying to figure out, we hold on to old concepts that are no longer even credible. And I would say, let go and allow yourself to be grasped by this mystery of God, who is coming, from the future. And I take that word future, just not in terms of the anticipation of what we will become, but also the radical, infinite possibilities of what we can become. God as that, absolute fullness of love in which all possibilities are held open. And so, it's our task, in a sense, to respond to that God who is dynamically, alluring and at the same time empowering. And every time we can respond, then that God becomes in us, and I think that's really exciting that God, Teilhard would say God and world are not opposed to one another. They're a complementary pair. Like, in a sense, God needs the world. And that's something we definitely haven't preached, right? We're pretty sure God doesn't need us and that we're just more of a thorn in God's side and we just hope we get saved by God. And Teilhard's like, oh, no, actually, we actually give to God something that God lacks. And that's, you might say, material presence, material existence. And there's something, that's what radical incarnation is about, right? The self-emptying of God, becoming nothing so as to become something. And I think Whitehead's notion that, we even transcend God in our own becoming so that God is transcended in us. And so there's a much richer dynamic relationship here that opens up to future in a way. I think if we could tap into it and deepen ourselves in it, we might want to go to church, and celebrate this incredible mystery of love we're engaged in.
So what does your own spiritual practices and piety and things look like now? Like, as someone who came back to faith out of this kind of hardcore science perspective, has gone on this theological quest, spent your time in the greenhouse with the sisters. Like, when you sit down with someone who resonates with your work but is new to cultivating spiritual practices and things, like, what kind of advice do you give? What kind of practices are giving life to you?
Yeah, again, I think, as I look at the own trajectory of my own prayer life, because I was trained in the monastery and then in convent life, where it was very regimented. You had an hour in the morning, an hour in the afternoon. I would say right now I have sort of wordless prayer. And for me, it's just being. It's just sitting quietly. It's just being in the presence of God. Sometimes I talk to God. No, most times I'm talking to God, but it's it's like, I feel like I have an ongoing relationship with God in some ways. But to me, it's experiencing on a deeper level a sense of interior freedom in God. And I can feel sometimes when that freedom gets a little thwarted or contracted by my own doing, the way I can get preoccupied with things, or I can attach myself to what someone said or what didn't happen. And I think my own journey has been a learning to let go at every step of the way, and a growing into that freedom. And I do think the more interiorly free I can be, the more I can actually celebrate a God who's doing new things in my life and in the world around me. But I do think we do need to take time, and I find my own self very busy at times. We're very, very busy people. And so we have to make a conscious effort just to stop, just to stop doing what we're doing and just to rest, in that magnificent presence of love, of holy love.
So when the church doesn't have a monopoly on the presence of God, and you come to find yourself as part of this beautiful network that is all creation, how does that change the way you participate in religious gatherings, religious community, and how you show up differently when you're in creation?
Yeah. I think I've grown into, because I do so much travel and speaking, and I'm constantly in so many different arenas, that I've learned to just really live in the present moment. And so, when whoever I'm with, it's usually just that person at that moment. The whole world for me is there. The whole of creation is there. And so I actually come to really enjoy and celebrate. I love interacting with people from different faith traditions. I find them so enriching. I find the beauty of the human person just in the face of that person. I'm really drawn in by the exchange of ideas that can deepen life. Sometimes we differ on things, and I find that, as celebrative as well, because I'm really interested. Why do you think like this, So I have found myself to be more not so much in a Lagos universe, but more of an ocean. And I find my own life sort of as a wave that keeps flowing onto the shores, where the grains of sand are people or events or, things. And then I bring that with me into my own life, as I recede back into this mystery of life that's my own. And so I think there's so much where we draw these lines of judgment and bias and ontologies, even our little ontologies that we set up for ourselves, like little dominoes. I think I've gotten rid of all that stuff, quite honestly. And I live in the flow. And I really do think life is about flow. It's flowing into and out of these relationships and with the beauties of the particular persons or the events or the communities that we are called into at that moment.
Oh, I think that's a very beautiful picture. And the last thing I wanted to know is, if someone has really enjoyed this conversation, what book of yours would you direct them to first, and then what are 3 books, broader books that you think are worth reading and wrestling with today?
Yeah. I think many people have told me that my book, The Unbearable Wholeness of Being, has been really helpful to them. Now, people are telling me they like my little meta-label lecture book, A Hunger for Wholeness, on soul, space, and transcendence, so that might be helpful as well. I think John Haught's book, God After Darwin, Deeper Than Darwin, is one of my favorites of his. I think he does a really fine job of systematically laying out, an evolutionary Christian life. And one of my favorites is Teilhard's Christianity and Evolution. Those essays in there are just really just incredible in his own thinking through in his own individual way, these deep questions of human becoming. There's just a ton of stuff to read. You can read all 17 of my books, and then you can go to Teilhard and Whitehead. No, I'm only kidding. And I would also go back to some of the early writers, Bonaventure. The Soul's Journey into God is a beautiful text. It's a classic, because Bonaventure there brings in creation, interiority, and divine transcendence, and the way he integrates those in the mystery of Christ is also an incredible thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for hanging out and taking the time. And
thank you. Great work that you're doing.
I've really enjoyed it, and it's always good to find out that someone you talk to in your head when you read them is even more awesome when they're on a computer screen and you're talking to them.
Thanks, Trip, and all the best to you there in Carolina, with the flood and stuff. I hope it all goes out to the ocean.
Well, I mean, God already said the next time's with fire, so we're good,
Oh, my goodness. All right. Blessings to you.
All right. Bye.